In the near future, the Jeffers Corporation claims to be the largest, friendliest, and most profitable business in the history of mankind. They promote the idea that success and happiness can only be achieved by mindless productivity, which kills people's independent thoughts and needs for intimacy. Their business logo is the middle finger, which is how everyone greets each other in this society. Because of all this stress, death by spontaneous explosion has been an escalating problem across the world. Employee George, who is a descendant of President Washington, works at level 3 of Jeffers Corporation. He greets the portrait of the CEO with the middle finger, and does the same for his co-workers Cindy and Todd. Nobody bats an eye when Todd takes out a gun to self-delete, and when he fails, he just sighs and goes back to work. Throughout the day, a voice announces how many minutes of productivity are left before the weekend. Suddenly George's work is interrupted by a call from Charisma, an employee from level 4. They're good friends and they share a sweet greeting before she sends George the day's workload through a pneumatic tube. George notices that Charisma added a post-it with a smiley face and he smiles, which isn't a common occurrence. Seconds later, Charisma calls again to tell him that their co-worker Mike won't be coming to work because he exploded last night. When George shares the news, Cindy points out Mike was tired, which is a symptom, and Todd shares that his therapist suggested using the empty gun every day to prevent himself from exploding. Soon the trio hears the sound of a person exploding nearby, but they must keep working as if it were normal. Meanwhile, George's wife Michelle watches a show about how to be happy, which includes a book with the best tips. After being stuck in the traffic for a while, George comes home and finds Michelle still glued to the TV. She doesn't even greet him or reply when he talks to her. Next he goes to check on his son, but the boy never leaves his room or answers anyone. Later over dinner, the couple only exchanges a few words and eat while the TV makes background noise. When they go to bed, Michelle complains about George turning on the TV because even at a low volume she claims to feel the electricity from the screen, yet she falls asleep anyway. George watches the news and learns that the amount of people who exploded has reached 100,001, and many victims had dreams. The next day, George goes to see his doctor, who puts him through a bunch of ridiculous exams. His brain scans are negative and the doctor can't diagnose the dreams properly, so he asks for some details. George says that for the last month he's been dreaming about being his ancestor George Washington, so the doctor explains that dreams can cause instability and pain but they aren't real, so he shouldn't talk about them. When George returns home, there's a guide showing some tourists what used to be the president's home and she hurts George by saying he chose an average calling unlike his ancestor. Afterward George goes inside and this time Michelle does greet him, but it's only because she's following her book on how to be happy. After dinner, George watches TV while overeating and learns of new symptoms related to exploding. No desire to do the dirty, difficulty sleeping, feeling life is meaningless, suffocation, and fantasizing about being somewhere else. Feeling called out, George changes the channel and watches a silly action movie with a guy who saves the world and gets the girl at the end. When he finally gets in bed, Michelle wants to get naughty and reveals she's brought some toys. However, George isn't interested and Michelle apologizes, asking him not to explode. During the weekend, George tries to relax while doing his usual hobbies, like sailing and golf. However, he never manages to actually have fun. On Monday, George plays the orientation video to their new co-worker Steve, reminding him to forget about himself and work his life away. Even the US president appears at the end of the tape to show his support for the company. While everyone is trying to work, Steve starts eating a raw hamburger, which makes Cindy complain. George explains to her that the man passed the test so there's nothing he can do about it. Steve overhears. He shares that he went from level 2 to level 3 after spending some time in jail. This makes everyone uncomfortable but they must endure it. At that moment Charisma calls George to check if his medical exam went well and sends him today's workload with a new post-it. When George goes home, Michelle has invited a pair of missionaries, who tell him explosions happen when people listen to Satan. George ignores them and checks on his son to scold him for ordering fantasy books that may stir up chaos, but the boy still doesn't answer. Suddenly, George notices someone screaming and running outside and it turns out to be his brother Julian. He explains he used to feel like a king in his job in level 5 but after he had a dream of his groin being replaced by the company logo, he decided to quit to avoid exploding. Feeling finally free, Julian's traveled to other countries and now practices pole vaulting. He also announces he'll be living in the family's pool house. Sometime later, George watches a show on TV where they present a man who supposedly had only 2 weeks left before exploding. They claim that when he started to see the beauty in things, he was able to survive. However, the poor man can only grunt when he tries to speak. This causes quite an impression on George and he goes to the kitchen to try to look for beauty in a flower vase, only to feel very frustrated and break it instead. That night, George has another dream of him being President Washington. The next day, George receives a call from Cindy, who informs him she's replacing Charisma on level 4. George pretends to listen to her rambling while staring at Charisma's post-it note, obviously bothered by this change. Afterward, the announcer informs everyone that someone left level 4 for not being productive and George gets the workload from Cindy, but her note only reminds him to be busy. When George gets home later, he ignores Cindy and starts overeating to deal with his stress while watching Julian practice outside. Julian notices him and tries to play fight with him, but George snaps and yells at his brother before walking away. Later that night, they receive a visit from Roger, a lifestyle coach hired by Michelle. Roger plays pool with George and then makes him exercise, always making him uncomfortable by touching him in inappropriate ways. Roger also gives George a massage and a beauty treatment, but George doesn't react to any of it. Roger gets frustrated and points out George has a great life with a good job and a great wife, so he should appreciate his luck more. He also urges George to be naughty with Michelle to be a real man. After Roger leaves, George tries to touch Michelle while she's sleeping, but she moans the TV host's name. Furious, George runs to the kitchen and grabs some food to overeat in front of the TV, but he stops himself at the last second. Then he checks a happiness package that arrived recently and tries on the happiness hat. However, he feels like an idiot and kicks the hat away before going outside to scream. George throws a tantrum as he goes to his shed, where he destroys everything in sight. He only stops when he finds his old war model, making him realize he's lost this hobby too. The next morning, George finds 3 teddy bears in the middle of the office. While Steve arrives on a scooter to lower his stress levels, George receives Charisma's termination form, which makes his mood worse. Soon an announcement explains that the bears are part of the new Cuddle Crew program to reduce stress and the risk of explosions, and they want the workers to spend as much time as possible with them. George grabs his and isn't impressed, but when Todd discovers the bears can talk, he instantly explodes. As he faints, George dreams about being Washington again. Todd and Steve bring him worrisome news about the war, but Dream George is confident and gives them plans to keep going. However, when he's alone, George considers surrendering until Charisma appears in front of him. Later at home, George learns that 300 people died of explosions today, including Roger. The news program shows a TV host during his last moments drunkenly losing his mind and saying he spent the donation money on sinful things before exploding. Afterward, George watches Julian do a successful blind jump for his friends, saying that he saw this moment in a dream. The next day, the employees get a new video promoting an inhibitor that supposedly will keep them happy while a janitor cleans off Todd's blood. Tired of it all, George gets Charisma's address from her termination papers and drives out of the city to visit her, bringing the bear with him. Eventually he arrives at a cozy cafe, and when the waitress asks for his order, he recognizes Charisma's voice. He's overwhelmed by the moment and instead of talking, he points at the menu to make his order. After Charisma moves to another table, George regrets coming and tries to leave, but he bumps into another client and accidentally says sorry. Charisma immediately recognizes his voice and invites him to sit and chat. The duo spends a lovely day together and talk until it's time for the cafe to close. George tells her he dreamed of her, and Charisma admits she's dreamed about him too. The following day, the company's CEO and the US president announce that using the inhibitor will be mandatory to stop explosions from creating chaos, and any worker showing potentially explosive behavior will be fired. When George goes home after work, he discovers Julian has brought lots of people to their lawn to teach them how to be free. Then he checks on Michelle, who is panicking just like her favorite TV host. It turns out the book ends by saying that happiness is to be happy, which nobody can understand. As the TV host has a breakdown, Michelle kisses George for comfort and soon they start getting naughty. However, Michelle brings up the book and kills George's mood. Afterward, George goes to talk to Julian, who informs his brother that the FBI is watching their place from the forest and may be planning a raid. Apparently people have reported Julian's group as a rebel party after the president announced the mandatory use of inhibitors. Then George tells Julian all about his dreams and meeting Charisma, admitting he had wanted to touch her hand but didn't dare. He's also very frustrated because meeting Charisma didn't bring the answers he seeks. Julian just responds by kissing George's head. Later that night, George tries watching TV but he can only see hallucinations of his boss, his crazy dreams combined with reality, and his awkward goodbye to Charisma. Sometime later, George is given a test with questions about his experience with the bear. After ignoring a question about his naughty relationship with the toy, George finds a request to draw a picture of his future. While he tries to concentrate, he watches how an employee from level 5 who can only grunt calls security, and a guard comes in to put an inhibitor on Steve by force. After work, George stands in the road for a while, thinking about going to see Charisma again but being too afraid to do so. Meanwhile, the radio announces they won't play music anymore. When George returns home, he's devastated to discover his son is gone for good. This makes him watch all the happy people in his backyard, making him think about his choices. Then he checks on Michelle, who is watching her favorite TV show in which the host self-deleted in front of the cameras. Michelle admits that she tried to do the same, but she can't because there's nothing left in her. This has made her realize that the people who exploded are better because they still felt something. Suddenly Michelle slaps George, and when he doesn't react, she says he has nothing left either. Next, Michelle goes to the kitchen to drink beer as she explains the last time she felt alive was when they met. She had always been drunk before meeting him, but he changed her. Both of them feel very frustrated and start thrashing the kitchen, wrecking anything they can grab until Michelle announces that she's leaving him. Seconds later, George gets a visit from the company CEO Jeffers. The man immediately starts ranting about the state of society, but George doesn't pay attention and watches the police arrest the people in his backyard. Jeffers admits that the company didn't think much of George until he drew a sunset as his answer to the future question. Then he takes George outside to meet the original founder Jeffers, whose health is hanging on a thread. Old Jeffers also rants about the war that has started in society, but he likes George's drawing and what it shows about his emotions. He promises that George can find peace in the new world and writes something on a card before giving it to George, telling him to do that so he can finally end his pain. After returning to the house, George finally reads the card and discovers that Jeffers wants him to kill the thing he loves. After lots of thinking, he drives to Charisma's cafe, only to discover everyone there is now brainwashed by the inhibitor, including Charisma herself. In fact, she doesn't even remember him, but George still invites her to his boat. Later at the boat, George removes Charisma's inhibitor and finally holds her hand, but sadly she still can't remember him. There's nothing left, just like Michelle said, so George grabs a knife, ready to do what the card said. However, Charisma suddenly starts crying and says his name as her memories come back. George immediately kisses her, and they spend the night getting naughty. The next morning, George sees President Washington in a boat nearby, saluting him in respect. George salutes back, feeling fulfilled and happy at last. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can watch more videos like this. Thanks for watching.